Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Anantha and I will be discussing clinical investigator inspection readiness. Previous presentations by my OSI colleagues, specifically on clinical investigator responsibilities, international trials, and GCP compliance review for NDAs and BLAs, were a nice setup for this presentation. We'll be reviewing what I hope will be a very practical nuts and bolts and boots on the ground approach to clinical investigator inspections. Well, this presentation is geared towards those who are not familiar with FDA inspections. I hope those that are familiar will find additional helpful information. Let's kick off with a poll question so I learn more about you. Which of the following best describes your current role? A, clinical investigator. B, study coordinator or other staff member at a clinical research site. C, employed by a sponsor, firm, or contract research organization, or D, other. Okay, great, thank you. Let's go back to the presentation. Today's learning objectives are as follows. Describe the purposes, focuses, and types of clinical investigator, or CI as I'll call it, inspections. Explain the inspection timeline and activities. List potential enforcement actions. And provide case examples of for-cause inspections classified as official action indicated, or OAI. FDA will evaluate the CI's clinical trial conduct for compliance with FDA regulations and GCP, including whether the investigation was conducted according to the investigational plan, whether there was control of the investigational product, and if informed consent, as well as IRB review and approval, were obtained. The goals are to ensure the right, safety, and welfare of human subjects, as well as the reliability of the safety and efficacy data submitted to FDA and marketing applications. We can start out by evaluating whether the study was conducted according to the protocol by reviewing such things as the eligibility criteria, the randomization and blinding procedures, study assessments, and administration of investigational product. Note that adherence to the protocol is also an FDA regulatory requirement, and other requirements include safety reporting, IRB approvals and correspondences, informed consent, financial disclosures, records management, and investigational product accountability. The types of CI inspections fall into two buckets. The first bucket is routine or surveillance. These are conducted as part of pre-marketing application reviews, such as that for a new drug application or NDA for drugs, or pre-market approval or PMA for medical devices. They are also conducted to assess compliance with the regulations, usually without FDA's prior knowledge of potential non-compliance issues. The second bucket is for cause. These are conducted to investigate allegations of potential violations that have not already resulted in an official agency action. But how do we learn about such allegations? We can receive referrals from FDA personnel, such as the Centers Review Division. We also receive reports from IRBs regarding unanticipated problems involving risk to subjects, serious or continuing noncompliance with the regulations, or suspension or termination of IRB approval. We also receive reports from sponsors regarding CI site suspensions, for example, an enrollment suspension, or site terminations for GCP noncompliance. And finally, we may receive complaints from study staff and/or subjects. The next section of this presentation will describe the sequence of an inspection. This is the order of activities, and we'll discuss each step in more detail. We generally pre-announce up to 5 days prior to beginning the inspection. And this is how inspections have been typically handled in the past, but whether to pre-announce or not is based on the situation, and inevitably there will be exceptions. As you can imagine, some for-cause inspections are not pre-announced. International or foreign inspections are generally pre-announced because of numerous and complicated logistics such as visas. We, of course, will look at the protocols and where the records are located. On site, the records may be paper and/or electronic. If there are off-site paper records, these are going to need to be pulled. The anticipated length of the inspection is dependent on the number of protocols inspected, the requested areas of specific focus, and factors at the site like CI and study staff schedules. There should be a separate work area with access to electrical outlets to plug in FDA laptops, as well as access to the internet and a scanner. Oftentimes, a study staff member can scan in paper documents. If the site is at an academic institution, for example, the site may have someone from the research office get involved. Each institution and sponsor may have their own requirements for how to handle an FDA inspection. Therefore, it's recommended that the CI notify the institution and/or the sponsor of an upcoming FDA inspection, because these parties can help the CI prepare for the inspection. Form FDA 482, Notice of Inspection, or 482, is issued by an FDA Office of Inspections and Investigations, or OII, investigator. This is only done for domestic or U.S. inspections and is presented to the most responsible party at the site, which is usually the CI. FDA personnel will present their credentials and note that these may not be photocopied per FDA policy. The opening meeting is performed day one of the inspection. A subject matter expert may accompany the OII investigator if certain clinical or medical expertise is required. For pre-marketing applications, there may be participation from another regulatory agency, such as the EMA, that will observe the inspection. With regards to paper and/or electronic records reviewed, listed here are examples of common study and subject records, but please note that these lists are by no means complete or exhaustive. The CI and study staff should make themselves available for interviews, meetings, and questions throughout the inspection. A site walkthrough is done to see storage of investigational products, such as in a refrigerator, also to see the examination rooms, laboratory space, etc. In general, FDA procedures require that the OII investigator observe study staff access and navigate through an electronic system. This is also known as providing, quote, over-the-shoulder access. Daily discussions between the OII investigator and site staff is a best practice to avoid any surprises at the end of the inspection, especially if the investigator is considering issuance of a Form FDA 483. As for resources, this CP provides instructions to the OII investigator on what to cover during the inspection. This and other CPs are updated occasionally, and some of them have been updated recently. The IOM provides general instructions on inspections, as well as specific information on BIMO inspections, and is updated annually. If issued, a Form FDA 483 or 483 is a summary of inspectional findings. It is extremely important to note that the 483 items are the OII investigator's observations of possible deviations from the regulations and not necessarily regulatory violations. It's going to be the center that will determine whether each observation is a regulatory violation, and if so, will determine the violation's impact on data integrity and subject safety. The 483 is issued to the inspected entity at the end of the inspection, and the CI may provide a verbal response to the 483 during a closeout meeting. Note that there may be items of concern not listed on the 483 that are discussed in the written inspection report. These don't necessarily rise to the level of a regulatory violation or a regulatory violation significant enough to put on a 483, but do warrant mentioning. Post-inspection activities are conducted by both the CI and the FDA. The CI is given the opportunity to respond in writing to the observations described on the 483 if issued. FDA is responsible for reviewing inspectional documents and assigning a final classification to the inspection. We'll start with post-inspection activities for the CI. Written response to the 483 is optional, but there's definitely good reasons to submit one. First, it demonstrates your acknowledgement and understanding of the observations to us. It also demonstrates your commitment to correct and hopefully prevent the recurrence of the observations. It gives you an opportunity to submit information for determining whether the observation is a supportable regulatory violation and may be considered in the final FDA compliance decision. If you choose to respond, the response must be received by the OII Investigator's Office within 15 business days after the close of the inspection. The OII Investigator's Office will forward your written response to the appropriate center for review. As mentioned above, the written response may be considered in the final compliance decision if it's received after the 15 business day deadline, and if the center is considering a warning letter. The response will be reviewed but will not be discussed in the warning letter. Following are suggested contents of a response to the 483. You should address each observation separately. You should indicate whether you agree or disagree with the observation. You should submit a corrective and preventive action plan, or CAPA, for each observation, noting which actions are already completed and when they were completed, and which actions are planned. You should provide a realistic timeline for completion of each planned action, as well as a method of verifying or monitoring the effectiveness of the actions. You should also submit supporting documentation, such as training records and standard operating procedures, or SOPs, as well as evidence to the contrary if you disagree with an observation. You can also consider including a commitment from senior leadership if, for example, your site is at a major academic medical center or institution. If you're part of a larger organization, this demonstrates the management and other organizational change influencers are on board with plans to improve site compliance. Overall, you should ensure that the response is well-reasoned, easy to follow, comprehensive, and submitted timely. Oh, I also wanted to mention too that you can group similar inspectional observations together when you're addressing the observations and provide a CAPA for those, but otherwise please submit a CAPA for each distinct inspectional observation. Now let's move on to post-inspection activities for the FDA. The OII investigator will draft the Establishment Inspection Report, or EIR, and will submit it, the supporting exhibits, and other documents such as the 483, if it was issued, the 483 written response, and the form FDA 463A, which is an affidavit, if applicable, to the Center for Review and Classification. If the 483 was issued and you choose to respond, I want to remind you that the response must be received by the OII Investigator's Office within 15 business days after the close of the inspection, and then the Investigator's Office will forward your response to the appropriate center for review. The center will then review all the inspectional documents and determine the final classification for the inspection. The center will then issue post-inspectional correspondence to the CI. So at this point, you might be thinking, why does the center review and determine the final classification instead of OII just doing it themselves? There are a couple reasons. First, the center has greater resources to be able to fully assess the case, meaning that there are medical and clinical experts in the review divisions and regulatory experts in the center and the Office of Chief Counsel. Second, there might be other inspections that are related and need to be assessed together, such as with a marketing application. And finally, it helps ensure consistency in decision-making across inspections. So, for example, an inspection in Seattle is reviewed and handled under the same criteria as an inspection in New York City. We're often asked, what are the most common regulatory violations observed in CI inspections? Note that these findings are from studies where the investigational product is a drug or a combination product where the primary mode of action is that of a drug, and therefore cite regulations pertaining to drugs. When determining the final classification for the inspection, the center will evaluate whether there are objectionable conditions, meaning an evaluation of whether subjects were exposed to an unreasonable and significant risk of injury, and/or subjects' rights, welfare, and safety were compromised, and/or data integrity and reliability was compromised. The evaluation whether there are objectionable conditions determines the final classification type, which is discussed on the next slide. So the first final classification is no action indicated, or NAI, where no objectionable conditions or practices were found during the inspection. The second classification is voluntary action indicated, or VAI, where objectionable conditions were found and documented, but the center is not prepared to take or recommend any regulatory action. Finally, the third classification is official action indicator, or OAI, where objectionable conditions were found and regulatory action is recommended. This is serious noncompliance requiring regulatory action. These violations are significant, and their scope, severity, and/or pattern support findings that subjects have been exposed to an unreasonable and significant risk of illness or injury, and/or data reliability has been compromised, and/or subjects' rights have been seriously compromised. If the inspection is classified OAI by the center may issue one of the following types of letters described on an upcoming slide. Note that NAI and VAI classifications are for deviations from the regulations, but these classifications do not meet the seriousness and significance of those classified as OAI. Now let's discuss some potential enforcement actions. These are the three types of letters that may be issued when an inspection is classified OAI by the center, presented in order of increasing severity. An untitled letter cites violations that do not meet the regulatory significance threshold for a warning letter. A warning letter is issued when objectionable conditions reach the threshold for regulatory action. Regulatory violations can be corrected through specific actions, and adherence to a CAPA is highly likely. So what is the threshold for regulatory action? The Regulatory Procedures Manual, or RPM Chapter 4, provides some insight into FDA's thinking on when warning letters are appropriate. You can also look at the FDA warning letter website link for examples of what kinds of issues prompt warning letters. A notice of initiation of disqualification proceedings, an opportunity to explain, or NIDPO letter, initiates proceedings to determine whether a CI should be disqualified from receiving FDA-regulated investigational products. FDA may eventually disqualify a CI if the CI has repeatedly or deliberately failed to comply with applicable regulatory requirements, or the CI has repeatedly or deliberately submitted false information to the sponsor or to FDA in any required report. A disqualified CI is not able to conduct any clinical investigations involving FDA-regulated products. Now let's see how we've assessed previous for-cause inspections and determined a final classification of OAI in two case examples that each resulted in a warning letter. The first case example describes a violation of failure to ensure that the investigation was conducted according to the investigational plan, specifically in a pediatric population, which is considered a vulnerable population. This specific protocol required that the study drug be administered according to a subject's weight, as well as in accordance with the protocol's titration schedule for the 20-week titration phase. So this titration phase consisted of specific dose increases at each study visit, and specifically at visit 2 for subjects 12 to less than 18 years old, they were to receive modified dosing. Unfortunately, doses exceeded this weight-based dosing, and in fact, the per protocol daily doses were substantially exceeded and were approximately 10 times the maximum daily dose. This considerably increased the risk of adverse events such as stress syndrome. We concluded from this that overdose in the vulnerable pediatric population raises significant concerns about subject safety. What was the CI's response? He promptly confirmed that no adverse events occurred. He provided instructions to subjects to reduce their dosage to the correct amount and have them come in for unscheduled visits. He also stated that the sponsor did not provide a dose calculator and that the algorithm lacked safeguards to prevent errors. He submitted a CAPA consisting of an SOP for dispensation processes and procedures as well. However, we were unable to determine whether the CAPA was adequate to prevent similar violations in the future because the response did not provide sufficient details about procedures implemented at the site. Therefore, we requested follow-up documentation of these procedures. The second case example also describes a violation of failure to ensure that the investigation was conducted according to the investigational plan. For this protocol, clinician-administered assessments related to efficacy endpoints were to be completed by a rater that was blinded to safety assessments. These blinded assessors were responsible for administering efficacy assessments such as the MATERs at certain study visits. Note that in this protocol, the primary objective was to assess efficacy of the study drug compared to placebo, as assessed by a change in this MATER score from baseline to week 4. In addition, the blinded assessor would not have access to the EDC system and subject source data to avoid potentially unblinding. However, this blinded assessor conducted MATER's assessments but was not blinded to certain safety assessments and performed a physical exam. We concluded in this case that unblinding raises significant concerns about the reliability and integrity of the data collected at this site. CI's response in this case was that he filed a protocol deviation and didn't conduct any additional MATER's assessments. He also submitted a CAPA with the following elements: identification of requirements that concern blinding, an annotation of worksheets that clearly identified blinded assessments. He was going to consult with both the sponsor and a consulting group to provide clarity in understanding protocol ambiguities, and that he and his site personnel would participate in various compliance trainings. As with the first case, FDA was unable to determine whether the CAPA was adequate to prevent similar violations in the future because, again, it did not provide sufficient details about the implementation of proposed practices being instituted at the site. Let's wrap up with 2 challenge questions. The first one: which of the following statements is not true? A, submitting a written response to the 483 is optional but is in your best interest. B, components of a written response include items such as the CAPA for each observation and supporting documentation. C, the most serious final inspection classification is OAI. Or D, items listed on the 483 are always regulatory violations. And the answer is D, items listed on the 483 are always regulatory violations. Question number 2, which of the following choices best completes the sequence of the inspection? So you start with pre-announcement, followed by fill in the blank, then the inspection, followed by the closeout meeting and the 483 if issued, and then finally post-inspection activities. Is it A, call the lawyer, B, gather relevant study records, C, a 482 an opening meeting, or D, contact your institution or the sponsor? And the best answer is C, 482 an opening meeting. Choices B and D are certainly specific activities that you can do before the inspection starts, but C is the best answer. So what are our take-home messages? So first, the overall purpose of our FDA inspections of CIs is to ensure adherence to the regulations and to GCP. The sequence of events in a CI inspection is standard and predictable. If a 483 is issued, there are definitely benefits in submitting a written response to it. And final classifications of inspections are NAI, VAI, or OAI. My closing thought is that the best way to successfully navigate an FDA inspection is to always be prepared for one. I encourage you to use this presentation as reference material to help prepare for an inspection with a goal for your site to always be inspection ready. I'm looking forward to discussing your questions in the upcoming Q&A session. Thank you.